Hello and welcome. My name is George, and my channel is all about helping you get the most out of Logic Pro so that you can record and produce your best music in your home studio. Today, we're continuing our series creating the song Late Night by Camaro 67 from start to finish, and today we're going to be focusing on mixing the bass. I'm going to show you my whole process for mixing bass for this song, so let's dive in. Okay, so here's our session, and previously we already mixed our drums, so I've got those unmuted, and next up we're going to be doing is the bass, and I'm going to leave everything else muted for now. So want to just play a little bit so you can hear what that's sounding like. So that's what the bass is currently sounding like without any plugins or processing. And this bass was performed by the great Jim Bennett. You can check him out on YouTube. He's got a great bass cover of Daft Punk's Get Lucky if you want to check that out. So for starters, one of the things you can check out in Logic Pro is there are built-in bass amps that we can throw on here. They're virtual bass amps, and they're really a quick and easy way to change the sound of the bass. So generally I use these when I'm not really happy with the bass sound to begin with, and I want to change the sound quite drastically. You can also do it subtly, but if you want to make a big change, this is one way to do it. Now, in this case, I'm quite happy with the bass that we started with, so we may or may not use it, but anyways, I'm going to check it out and see if we like it. And if not, then I just won't use it. So we'll go over here to our audio effects on our bass track, go down to amps and pedals. And then here we have bass amp designer. And now we have 4 different models. So 3 different amps and then a DI box. So this modern amp, this classic amp, flip top, and direct box. And each of these models have an amp and a cabinet, and you can mix and match these as you want. So if you want, the classic amp with the modern cab, you can do that, or, change as you want. And then you can also blend between the amp and the direct box as well. And then lastly, you can also change the microphone and change the position of the microphone as well. So lots of different options here. And as I mentioned, this will change the sound quite a bit of what you started with. So for example, I'll just run through a few presets and you can see kind of what that sounds like. So for example, I'll start with this muted, and then I'll unmute it and run through some different presets, and you'll see how the sound changes quite a bit. So you see, you have a lot of different options. And as I mentioned, it's just a way that you can change the sound real quick. Now, out of those, I think that 70s Solid was probably my favorite. And I'm just going to compare that with the original. So the amp sounds good. I like this 70s Solid preset. The one nice thing about the amp too is you have your EQ and your compressor built right in. So, this again is an easy way to shape the tone. If you want, let's say, less bass, then we can pull this back. So it's an easy way to brighten things up. And again, your compressor right there. The mic choice and placement will also affect the tone as well. So that's something to explore too. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and remove the plugin. As I said, I'm quite happy with the sound that we started with, so I don't need to do anything too drastic. The main thing I'm going to look to do is just level out the dynamics a little bit with some compression, and then just make sure that the bass fits nicely with the drums, in particular the kick drum, and make sure that neither of those get lost. And just as a side note of how we recorded this, so we recorded this just direct using a DI box, so there's no bleed, as you can hear. It's totally isolated from the other instruments. Now, on the room mics, for example, you can hear a little bit of the bass amp that was recorded in the room. But the bass track itself is totally isolated, and that makes it real nice and easy to mix. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw on my trusty Slate digital virtual tape machine. So this just applies a little bit of subtle coloration, and I find it just kind of warms up the whole thing, and I just overall just kind of like what it does. The few settings I like to change are the machine type. I'll generally go for the 2-inch for most of the instrument, and I'll leave the 1/2 inch in the mastering. And then the speed, generally I prefer the 15 EPS, but I will listen back and flip that and see which one I prefer. Same with the tape type. So let's have a quick listen to that. So I'm going to stick with those settings. And maybe you heard when I bypassed it, it just seems to liven up and, again, have a bit more body to it when it's on. The next thing I'm going to load in is, again, by Slate Digital, the virtual mix rack. And I talked about this a little bit in the drum mix video. So this is a mix rack. So basically you can have a bunch of different processing kind of all in one plugin. Now this virtual channel, this is kind of just a virtual console, and you can choose between some different models. So the Brit N, this is modeled after a Neve. The Brit 4K, the SSL. Generally, I prefer the Brit N. Again, just has that body and warmth, and kind of that's the sound that I always seem to gravitate to. I'll go ahead and mute the rest of these processes just so we can just hear what the virtual channel is doing, and you can see the difference. So again, it just fills it out a little bit. And you'll notice the meters here, the more we go into the red here, the more that saturation is going to occur, much like it would with the console. If you want to dial this back, you can have the inputs and outputs linked, which they are now, so you can bring down the input without affecting the volume. So I'll just bring it down a bit. So we're, going into the red a little bit, but nothing's really overdriven. Next, we'll move on to a compressor. And I'm going to go ahead and use this FG Stress, which is modeled after a distressor compressor. And so why don't I go ahead and close this one because I'm not going to use it. And I'll turn that on. And we can take a peek at our presets here. And let's try the fat and warm. And let's go ahead and play a little bit of that. Okay, so now right off the bat, it's compressing quite a bit. You saw it was kind of 5 to 6. And this compressor doesn't have a regular threshold knob like most compressors. It actually compresses based on the input. So I'm going to back off the input a little bit here. So I'm going to dial it in to be around kind of the 2 to 3 dB of gain reduction. Now we have a 4-to-1 ratio, so that's nothing crazy. So nice and gentle without being overly squashed. Now, of course, you can apply any compressor. So even if you don't have exactly what I'm using, you can load in the Logic compressor. For example, the Studio Fed is a nice choice based off the 1176 compressor. The Vintage Opto is nice as well based off the LA2A. So let me go ahead and close this and I'll just remove the Logic compressor. And let's just have a little before and after with the distressor. Now it does get a little bit louder based on this output. I could pull this output down a bit to match the volume a bit more. But as the name of the preset suggests, the fat and warm, I definitely get that out of this compressor. So I'm liking how that's sounding. And the basic goal here for the compression is just to make sure that kind of all these bass hits are leveled out a little bit. So, there's a few, for the most part, Jim's a very consistent bass player, but even you can see like a few notes here that are played a little bit quieter than these notes here. The higher notes a little bit more, right? So that just helps kind of even that out a little bit. So it'll compress these louder notes a little bit more and let these quieter ones come through and just overall just kind of balance that out throughout the song. So let's now move on to our EQ. And again, I have EQ in this mix rack. There's kind of an SSL style EQ here and then a Neve style EQ here. And how I like to work is maybe a little bit different than most people. I like to use the Logic EQ to kind of scan frequencies and boost and cut what I like and don't like. And then I'll actually apply those moves on either the Neve or SSL here, just because I tend to prefer the sound that these produce. But I do find the Logic one kind of easier to dial things in just because I can scan real quick and easy. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so what I've done is I have a few cuts that I've actually left on the Logic EQ. I left these on the Logic EQ just because I find it a little bit easier to dial in. And for the cuts, I'm not too worried about getting kind of the sound of the plugin. Is just to kind of remove some frequencies. So I just removed a little bit at 180 basically, and also kind of from 100 hertz and below. So we're just removing a little bit of the bass, just so we're not kind of overpowering there. And then over here on the Neve EQ, I just did a little 2 decibel boost at 772 and another boost at 1.72 kilohertz at 2.91 decibels. And I'll just play a little before and after with the EQ. So starting with it on. So just a little bit more defined by pulling out a little bit of that low end and adding a little bit more of that higher end in there. And then the last thing I like to add a little bit of in here, again, just to add a bit more presence, is this Revival plugin. There's a shimmer knob and a thickness knob. If you needed more bass, you could crank the thickness knob. But in this case, I'm just going to add a little bit of that shimmer in there. To be honest, it's not doing a whole lot, but anyways, I'll just leave that in there just because. Now let's just do a little before and after of where we are right now, because I'm pretty pleased with how it's sounding. So this is before with all my plugins muted. So definitely a lot more body and presence with those plugins that we added. Now, one thing that I don't do often, but I'm going to try it here, is a little bit of saturation on the bass. And where this can help is if you have, let's say on an iPhone or a cell phone, small speakers, they don't reproduce a lot of bass, and a lot of times the bass just disappears completely. But adding a little bit of saturation is going to add some of the higher harmonics from the bass so that those still can get reproduced by smaller speakers. So for this, I'm going to try the Logic plugin. I'm going to try the Chromaglow. So if we go to distortion and Chromaglow, that looks like this. So you can use Chromaglow to, add a lot of distortion and really change the sound. And that's not really what we're after with this. We're just after adding a little bit of harmonics in there, again, just to help this kind of cut through when we're listening on smaller speakers. So just to show the extreme, why don't we change the style to colorful, and I'm going to crank the drive and you'll see what's happening. right? So we're getting a lot of that distortion, which could be cool for the right tune, but probably not what I want in this context. Now, one trick you can try is actually have it overdriven this much, but just dialing back the mix. So let's see about that. So in this scenario, now you're still getting that kind of overdriven sound, but only kind of 10% of it. So you're getting those upper harmonics without getting kind of overloaded of that distortion. Now, for this particular song, I think that's still a little bit overdone, but just to kind of show you what you can do. Now, I was messing with this a little bit earlier, and I was kind of liking the slightly warm preset. So I'm going to start with that, and you can hear what that sounds like on its own. So again, just brightens it up a little bit. But now again, I'm going to pull back the mix. So the drive's at about 77%, and I'm going to pull this back too. So again, that's just going to give us some of those upper harmonics that hopefully when we listen to back on some smaller speakers, your phone, for example, that those are still going to come through. So let's do one final listen of before and after and see if we're happy with how that's all sounding. So let's start with everything off. Great. So nothing too drastic, really just cleaning it up and making sure that everything is heard nice and cleanly. Now, the last thing I'll do is I'll just go ahead and bring the bass all the way down and blend that back in with our drums. Great, I'm happy with that. Now, the one important thing you want to make sure with the bass is the relationship between the bass and the kick drum, and just make sure that both of those are heard. And in this case, I am happy with where that is. And if we just solo the both of them, you'll be able to hear that they're not conflicting. So the bass isn't overshadowing the kick, and the kick isn't overshadowing the bass. Now, if that does start being a problem, then your best bet is EQ, to either carve out some space in the kick for the bass, or same thing with the bass, you can carve out some room in the bass for the kick drum. Another technique that's sometimes used is side chaining. So you can side chain either the kick or the bass so that anytime the bass is playing, it'll bring the kick down a little bit, or vice versa. Anytime the kick is playing, it'll bring down the bass a little bit, and that'll help bring up one or the other. For myself, I generally use EQ if I need to, but if you just make sure that your bass isn't overly bassy or the kick isn't overly bassy, and that each of them have their own place in the mix, then you should be all good to go. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please leave those in the comments below. And I also want to thank you for all the likes and subscribes. And if you want to improve your workflow in Logic Pro, don't forget to download my free Ultimate Logic Pro Starter Pack. This includes my Logic Pro hotkey cheat sheet with all the most common shortcuts right at your fingertips, as well as my audio recording guide to make sure that your recording sessions go as flawless as possible, my mixing guide with references to all the most common Logic Pro mixing plugins, and my gear guide if you're just getting started and want to know exactly how to build your home studio. And lastly, my Logic Pro session templates to help you get started right away. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one.